Sorry, I can't be there in person. I was very much looking forward to it. But I wanted to thank you all for listening, and also Iris for having me speak on this very interesting discussion around intersections, and particularly a vision for an inclusive bioeconomy. I think hopefully I'll be emphasizing or re-emphasizing some of the ideas that the previous speakers, Jenna and Carmen, have talked about, particularly around a focus on design, systems thinking, regenerative thinking, circular economy, bringing everyone together. And I will do this in the process of talking about some of my journey and some of the work I've been engaged with, and the various intersections I've come across, which I think are interesting or important to consider when we talk about the bioeconomy. So firstly, my background is as a materials engineer, materials scientist. I studied engineering and maths at Nottingham a while back, and did some research on bio-based composites, particularly based on flax, so linen, hemp, jute, to make wind turbines. So already a green sector, green energy, but we all know about the landfill issues associated with wind turbine blades and this design life aspect of products. And we do things, but don't necessarily think about what the impact might be after 20 years, after 30 years, after 40 years. And that's why what Jenna talked about in terms of a systems thinking and thinking ahead is particularly relevant. Then I spent a bit of time as a postdoc at Oxford, looking at bio-inspired materials, looking at elephant ivory from a conservation perspective, at silk as well, to make innovations in high toughness applications, for instance. And then I've spent about past 8 years or so in the architecture department at Cambridge, working on structural materials with timber, bamboo, and continuing a lot of the work on these fiber-based composites. So again, touching on some of the similar issues around agroforestry and how that can contribute to the bioeconomy. One of the aspects I wanted to focus on in this particular slide and my journey was this interdisciplinarity and collaboration, because this is quite central. And I think so far, we have continued to value specialists, so people who are experts in one specific discipline. But I think increasingly there is an understanding that specialist generalists are very important in terms of people who are T-shaped practitioners. They have a depth of expertise in a single area, but then also a breadth of experience covering a wide range of areas. And that is quite critical in interfacing how these ideas can work towards different aspects of the bioeconomy, because we all have to work together. And it's not just about communicating. I think that's fairly easily understood. We need to be able to communicate with each other. It's more about co-creating, working together to create new ideas, visions, products, systems, etc. And we believe in this idea quite a lot. And at Cambridge, we have tried to create a new undergraduate degree program from scratch called the Design course, in which we are hoping to merge the arts and sciences together and develop students with skill sets of specialist generalists who are able to work across teams of scientists, of designers, of structural engineers, etc. So this idea about interdisciplinarity is quite critical from my perspective. The other aspect I wanted to focus on was to do with design being at the intersection, at the confluence of many of the pillars of a bioeconomy or an economy. So from my perspective, and I often talk to this about with students, and I think this is inspired by the IMOS paradigm as well, from the Materials Research Institute or Materials Research Society, in which materials, environment, technology, history, they all work together. And it is design that is at the confluence of these, particularly because people don't, the layperson does not necessarily understand materials as such. So for example, even if you look at the simple plastic bottle, they might not necessarily know that a plastic bottle has PET as the base component and then a polypropylene cap. They might not know what technology is used to make the plastic bottle. They might not necessarily know the overall implications on the environment of where things land up or how the design evolved. But what they do experience is this interaction with the plastic bottle. And as co-creators, as designers, we can influence how people interact with these, and also to manage this interaction between people and nature much better as well. And I wanted to emphasize in this aspect something Carmen talked about as well, that design is not just about the product. It's about responsibility. It's about how we can get nature and people to to work together symbiotically. And responsible design particularly requires constant redesign to ensure tackling new and emerging global challenges or addressing appropriate technology requirements, often relating to new constraints. So for instance, from a designer's perspective, constraints are extremely helpful in focusing design work. And some of these constraints can be environmental. So for example, we have worked on projects related to biodegradable plant pots. Plant pots in the UK alone, we produce 500 million annually. 87% are not even collected for recycling because of issues with curbside recycling. And we worked on a project with an industry partner to produce some biodegradable plant pots, but then realized that actually biodegradation can be a false economy from a life cycle cost perspective, because it might not lead to a behavioral change in terms of single-use cultures. And actually using recycled materials or waste so-called materials is much better. So they actually use recycled coat hangers to produce their plant pots. And recycling happens 60 miles or so from their site in Edinburgh. So it is a much more local bioeconomy that they work towards as well. Some constraints can be socioeconomic. So we have worked on affordable orthotics that are low cost, produced from recycled waste plastics, particularly jerry cans or again, plastic bottles for disabled children that would enable them to go back to school or to nurseries for daycare, while their parents and grandparents then have time to contribute to the economy and earn money, because again, empowerment of people relies on being able to earn livelihoods. And some of that is related to using locally available resources rather than importing orthotic sheets from the US or from Europe at the same cost that would be for a single sheet to produce two affordable devices or two devices. That would be the same cost as the salary of a technician for half a month or something of that sort in Kenya. So it's that sort of thinking as well. And some of the constraints can be health related or supply chain constraint related, and something we experienced during the coronavirus spread as well, where we were developing our own infection controls face shields using origami techniques that school kids could produce, and using multi-technology solutions. If you wanted to use a pen, you could produce it through that. If you wanted to use die casting, you could produce it to that. If you wanted to use laser cutting, you could manufacture it through that. And we uploaded these designs on GitHub as open sources as well. So it's actively understanding and responding to new constraints through a process of redesign that helps this build this sort of resilient circular bioeconomy. We are also very interested in translating science to design and understanding design through science. So this intersection of science and design is very fun for us. For instance, with Ben, we have worked on bamboo cricket bats. We had a hunch that we work with bamboo for the construction sector to make structural beams and columns for school buildings, for instance. And we thought, because of this shortage in willow supply, and because England supplies all of the vast majority of the world's willow for cricket bats, most of it actually being produced in the subcontinent in India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, for example, What if we could actually use local resources, bamboo being a fast-growing material, to develop these products? So we started from the science. We measured the material properties of bamboo and then went on to design, working with the bat maker and ourselves to develop interesting shapes that would work. And we are currently looking at the commercialization of these ideas. On the other aspect, for instance, with this bamboo pavilion, we started with the design process. So Michael Ramage, Anna Gatu, and Bhavna Sharma, who are architects and designers, thought we wanted to create this interesting shell structure, like a spiral staircase. And they knew about this heat bending technique that could work with bamboo. And they were working on this. And once we produced this shell structure, we then thought, how can we actually explain this through science? Why does it actually work? And did some thermomechanical experiments on the material, which then enables us to produce new designs that are even more optimized. So it's this constant dialogue between science and design that can be quite interesting as well. One of the intersections we come across quite regularly is to do with length scales. And as a scientist working on the fundamental level, but also super interested in the applied level, this is particularly close to my heart, because nature in itself is fascinating, and how it works at the molecular scale, at the nanoscale. And if we can copy that, that would be phenomenal. So if you think about even the human body and how medicine has come forward, we know how to solve or understand and treat us better because we understand how the DNA works, how protein works, at this molecular level much better. Similarly, if we want to use these bioresources better, we need to be able to fundamentally understand how does wood come together? How do these structured polymers of cellulose, hemicellulose, lignin, pectins, they all come together naturally through a process of self-assembly without high energy requirements or carbon emissions to produce these wonderful materials, and yet have these fascinating multifunctional properties of transferring nutrients, water, but also being structural materials. So we work with plant scientists and biochemists to look at genetically modified plants, poplars, Arabidopsis, and seeing how these cell walls come together from both a perspective of taking these materials apart, because often that's what we tend to do in biotechnology, particularly if you're producing fuels, for example, but also then bringing them back together if we want to create a product out of it. We work with chemists and fluid dynamicists to understand how we can improve the properties of woods by impregnating them with polymers or modifying it with chemicals. And then we work with architects, structural engineers, including in practice, to develop these visionary concepts. For example, what would a 300-meter tall timber tower look like? And inform policies through that. And some of these are visionary in the sense that you might not see a 300-meter tall timber tower tomorrow, perhaps not even in 10 years' time, and it's not necessarily a good idea. But if we can demonstrate that a 300-meter tall timber tower is possible, and it's good for the environment because it is locking carbon in the physical structure of the building, then perhaps a 100-meter tall timber tower would be a no-brainer. And in fact, the tallest wood buildings now in the world, in Norway, at UBC, in Canada, in Austria, in Vienna, all of these are 80 meters tall, for example, and they're becoming taller and taller. But what we need, of course, are more mid-story structures, which are easily doable with timber. A final or a penultimate intersection is to do with the supply chain. And I think Carmen and Jenna both have talked about this very well. It's about getting everyone winning. And I agree completely with Jenna was mentioning. We need to know, for example, what farmers are thinking. If we want them to grow more hemp or flax, how can we get them to understand or make sure that the economics works for them? And also how they measure properties in terms of the quality of flax or hemp is very different to how I, as a scientist, measure the quality of the plant. And it's very different to how someone in industry might measure the quality of the fibers. and understanding the links between them is particularly important. So for example, farmer particularly looks at the color of the fiber. They look at the uniformity in the spread of the color. They look at also the individualization of the fibers, but all of this is qualitative, and they make a subjective judgment, and then that is transferred to industry, in which they have to give a value of some money to the farmers based on actually how much they can sell on, based on, I don't know, the strength of the fiber, or how much can be converted into a textile that has uniform properties, because it would go into the automotive sector, and the automotive sector is particularly keen on this traceability of materials, on uniformity of properties, things of those sorts. So I think that sort of constant dialogue and understanding of shared values and priorities is particularly key to develop interesting products that are going to be useful and important for the society. We also work quite closely with practitioners and other visionaries. So for example, with Steve Barron, who is a film and TV director, wanted to start a hemp farm in Cambridgeshire in Pidley, particularly because it remediates the soil. The growing of the hemp itself is good for the environment because you sequester carbon. And he got us involved because we had some experience with working on high value applications with composites. So we work with Red Digital Cinema to make these movie camera cases, for instance. But he also had Paloma Gomli, Summer Islam from Material Cultures involved to actually make a hemp house, the flat house. And many of you must have seen this, for instance, where the key components of the building are made using hemp sugar-based bioresin rain screens, hemp lime insulation for the interior, hemp-based plasters, to make this completely autonomous home, solar powered, wind powered, as well as using waste resources from the farm, and almost completely produced using agroforestry resources. So timber structure, reclaimed steel from the barn that was existing there. And working on these prototype projects, these demonstrator projects, is quite critical, because one of the issues, I think Jenna mentioned this, is, and Carmen mentioned this, is to do with certification. The construction industry is particularly super slow, and you need to get buy-in from many of these players to get the industry moving along with you. Finally, I think I wanted to touch on this idea around technology and heritage, and technology and craft. I think this is super critical. Today, we often value quantity much more over quality. And again, high skills much more over craft skills, which are equally important. We don't always need high skills. We need a diversity of skill sets to particularly get the bioeconomy running. So we work with historic textiles, 4,000, 7,000 years old, 10,000 years old from Egypt, as well as from Peru, Colombia, trying to understand how farmers or hunter-gatherers, how people used to produce fibers and textiles then, how has the process evolved now, why have those evolutions come, and what can we learn from those approaches. We have a Cognate project, Carmen is involved in this, on looking at vegan leathers for cricket gear, for example. And one of the things we are learning through that is it's a cottage industry. A lot of cricket balls are made from hand stitching processes, and it's completely dead in the UK now. So it's actually an extinct industry in the UK, because the price of making a cricket ball is not valued, or it is not at the same level as how much time that goes into it. So I think we need to appreciate this difference between craft and technology and value these equally. So finally, I think just re-emphasizing some of these ideas that we've spoken about, focusing on addressing inequity and sustainability. The ideas around donut economics that Kate Raworth has developed are super exciting. We need to bring people out of this hole in the middle of the donut. So take everyone along with us, but also remain within these planetary boundaries. Collaborative and sharing spirit. I love that Carmen spoke about giving materials away, and they are one of the few innovators in this space who do continue to share everything very openly, and that's very unusual and refreshing. Ideas around interdisciplinarity, learning and making, and that's something I value very much about designers. We just go and try and test ideas. Sometimes it will work, sometimes it won't, but I think that's quite critical, this experimental approach, and then being regenerative and not exhaustive. So I think I'll leave that there, and then if we have any questions, but we can talk this through together as well. Thank you. I can't hear you, so just mentioning that.
Darshil, can you hear us?
Yep, thank you.
Anybody have a question for Darshil? We're stunned by its eloquence. Darshil, you didn't mention your 4,000-year-old mummy flax. What?
Yeah, so this is some on this slide. We're working with the Louvre Museum, for example, to understand how the Egyptians used to produce textiles 4,000, 7,000 years ago. And currently some of the projects are on fishing nets, for instance, which are quite interesting because we have found similar fishing nets in Peru 10,000 years ago, used by hunter-gatherer societies, and the techniques they're using are very, very similar, but on very different fibers, because the Peruvians were using asplaceous, which is milkweed fibers, whereas the Egyptians were using using linen, flax fibers, but the hairballs they were producing are very similar. The net structures they're producing are very similar. We don't exactly know what sort of techniques they're using. So Camila Alde, she did a wonderful PhD on this aspect of how dance is used as a metaphor, particularly women using movements with their bodies, because craft is a very active, dynamic process of producing things, and how you use your hand motions, how you hold objects together to produce things using specific tools has big influence on the overall structures that are developed, these architectures that are developed. But we also see very similar morphologies in these Egyptian linens. So we are trying to get a sense of how these ideas have evolved separately but converged. And you get this idea in biology very often of this convergence of things. An interesting area we're looking at is also cotton. I'm not sure how many of you know, but it's particularly in the 18th century or late 17th century when we moved towards cotton because of this cotton engine that was developed in the US. But until then, flax and hemp particularly were the base materials for in Europe, in the US as well. And it was just because flax and hemp were maybe 10 years behind this cotton engine that was developed, that cotton took over, and now flax and hemp and other bast fibers are significantly far behind where cotton is. So we produce about 25 million tons of cotton a year, but only about 2 million tons of hemp and linen in comparison. And probably because of this rapid industrialization and the prioritization of quantity over quality, and also the associated damage with the slave trade, with how we commodified people. I think this is all very integrated and important to understand if we want to develop an inclusive.
Thanks, Darshil. We have another question in the room.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Darshil. Thank you for a really wonderful talk. Following on what you're saying about the different fibers, are the different fibers or these sort of cultures used, do they have similar properties? And if they don't, has the morphology of the weave that they're using been adapted so that the end fabric has similar properties?
Yeah, really good question. So plant fibers have very, very different morphologies, and I can share an image later on if I can find it. in which, for example, bamboo fibers are amazing. They have up to 10 different cell wall layers, whereas flax has 3 primary cell wall layers. And if you look at coir, so cotton or pineapple leaf fibers, again, they are very different cell wall layers. So their properties are also very different. Although their base materials are similar, cellulose, cellulose, lignin, hemicellulose, it's how they are arranged that is different, and also the structure features are very different. So for instance, the luminal cavity is different, the microfibril angle, so how the cellulose fibrils are oriented around the axis of the fibers, is very different. And so some fibers are much more stretchy and have very good fatigue performance, flexibility, for instance. And this is also slightly understood from their evolutionary properties. So pineapple leaf fibers, for example, or sisal leaf fibers, again, leaves have evolved to flutter in the wind so that they don't break off. Whereas if you have a stem fiber like bamboo or flax, this is actually holding the structure of the plant. So it needs to have slightly different performance criteria as well. So there are nuances, and therefore the materials that are evolved from them that we can derive can also be quite different. I must say that it is also partly related to how we process these materials. So hemp, for instance, it's quite difficult to get it to be as smooth as you get linen fibers, partly because hemp fibers, most fibers exist in bundles, and therefore it's to do with how easily can you get these pectinous layers removed to get single individualized fibers. And this was particularly interesting with Egyptian linens because they had a very perfect way of producing individualized fibers that are very thin in diameter, 25 micron, whereas if you go to industry today, often fibers will be in bundles of maybe 100 micrometers in diameter, and you might get 5 or 6 fibers that are clumped together. So all of these issues around how we extract fibers can also influence the performance. But there is a lot of work around this done by colleagues all over the world.
Okay, another question?
Yes.
Yeah. Darshil, I'm really fascinated by your talk, but also something more conceptual that we were talking about innovators at the beginning, that their work is specialist generalists. And it's amazing to see examples of the work of these people, but there are still a few people like you, people you presented the work. So what can we do as a society, maybe education sector, the funder, to encourage and enable this new career path? What needs to happen? What kind of barriers did you encounter in kind of developing in intersections of art and science? What society needs to do to grow new innovators like you?
I think, yeah, that's a very good question. I think we are generally moving in that area, particularly employers are quite keen on these specialist generalist skill sets because they recognize a lot of the global challenges that we have. And with Industry 4.0, where we recognize that there is this blurring of the digital, physical, biological spheres, and you need to have a broad understanding of ideas. And also our jobs are not likely to stay the same with artificial intelligence coming in and creativity being particularly important so that we don't automate everything. There is a general understanding. There is some reluctance in the education sector, partly because it is informed by accreditation, for instance. So if we can change accreditation of how engineering is accredited or architecture is accredited and what these accreditation bodies find or important or prioritize, I think that's quite critical. But also these networks like the Bioladies network, the Natural Material Association network, and other sorts of networks like these, and degree programs that are a bit more liberal. And we recognize that you don't get everything you learn from a 3-year undergraduate degree or a 4-year undergraduate degree. You might want to nip into a month-long course later on in your career, or if you want to do continuous professional development throughout your career. I think that'd be important ways to make sure we are all attuned with changing priorities.